Hi, and welcome to Demystifying Contemporary Antisemitism. My name is Rabbi Mike Urim. I'm the Chief Jewish Learning Officer at Jewish Federations of North America, and I was a Hillel director for over 16 years at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm excited to share with you both some theoretical information about understanding antisemitism, tied in with some real-life examples of how it functions in our cities, universities, and in contemporary North American life today. Welcome, everyone. We're going to try to demystify contemporary anti-Semitism. One of the biggest challenges we have is that there's actually different types of anti-Semitism out there. And until we are able to diagnose each form correctly, it's really hard to know what the strategy is. So I want to tell you one quick story to get us started. I was a Hillel director for many years, including 16 years at the University of Pennsylvania. And towards the end of my time there, we had a meeting with students from Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP. And at the end of the meeting, it was a strange meeting, but at the end, the student leader said, I just want you all to know that I'm not anti-Semitic. I have lots of Jewish friends, but, and we know that whatever comes after the but is not going to be good. And she then said that Jews are too rich, that we control the university, that basically we control the media, and that as a Palestinian woman, she just doesn't feel comfortable with so many Jews on campus. And as we walked out of the meeting, the three Hillel student leaders, all of whom went to Jewish day school and spent time in Israel and were good, strong Zionists, all three of them said, wow, Rabbi Mike, I had no idea how difficult it is to be a Palestinian on campus, as did the university administrator who said the very same thing. And so what's interesting is all four of those people missed that this young woman blew every anti-Semitic dog whistle in the book. And so what I started to realize between that and a number of other experiences I had on campus is that when we train people to think about anti-Semitism, we teach them about Jew hatred. We teach them about the Holocaust. We teach them about very obvious forms of anti-Semitism where people hate Jews consciously or want to kill them. And so when this young woman said all three of these things, neither the university administrator nor the students themselves understood the nuance or the complexity of how anti-Semitism functions. And so they missed it. All those dog whistles, Jews being rich, Jews controlling the media, were all missed. So I want to share a tool that I think can really help us demystify the different types of anti-Semitism and can help us figure out how to diagnose which type we're dealing with. And implied in that diagnosis is different ways of fighting that form of anti-Semitism. So here I'm borrowing from Dara Horn's essay from the Jewish Review of Book many years ago. It's a wonderful essay. The link is down below on the slide deck. She basically decides and divides all of anti-Semitism into two different forms. The first, when I'm teaching this to larger audiences, I use the word conscious anti-Semitism, or even you could say this is Jew hatred. And here it's based on the story of Purim, where a political leader calls for the physical annihilation of the Jews. So this is the Purim story. This is Hitler. This is people marching through the streets of Charlottesville chanting, Jews will not replace us. This is a physical threat to the Jewish body. And this is often the form of anti-Semitism that we see on the extreme right with white nationalist group and neo-Nazi groups. These are also the people who attack synagogues or Jewish buildings because their idea is that the only way for Jews to be okay is when they're dead, and that essentially that their bodies need to be killed in order to purify or to make our society safer or cleaner. To some degree, this is a relatively easy form of anti-Semitism to diagnose because these folks are very clear and transparent about what they believe and what they want to do. And generally speaking, even today, the vast majority of polite society in the Western world will condemn physical threats against Jews and this form of conscious anti-Semitism. But where I think it gets really interesting is that Dara Horn also talks about something that she calls Hanukkah anti-Semitism, but I call unconscious anti-Semitism or implicit anti-Semitism, especially if I'm doing these trainings with folks in universities or city councils or in local government. And the way that unconscious anti-Semitism works is it doesn't show up as conscious named Jew hatred. Rather, it focuses and functions much more under the surface, almost as an unspoken deal between the host culture and the Jewish community, that if Jews shed the things that make them different or distinctive or in some way threatening, whether that is ritual actions or ways of dressing, ways of speaking, or a certain political ideology, then they will be accepted. And in this way, unconscious anti-Semitism divides the whole world into kind of the good Jews and the bad Jews. And this is a feature that we see in every other form of discrimination, in racism and sexism and homophobia, where the bad guys in the story divide the minority group into the good ones and the bad ones. The good ones are the ones who are willing to be women, but are not so feminist that they're threatening. It's okay if you want to be a person of color, but you're not so distinct in the way that you express that identity that it's threatening to the power group. So the very fact that there is this unspoken deal is already a form of discrimination and marginalization. But on top of it, unconscious anti-Semitism is very hard to diagnose because it keeps morphing over here. It's rarely ever about a physical threat to Jews. It's much more about a psychological threat, where Jews begin to internalize that being who they are, expressing who they are out in public is in some way threatening, and they should kind of hide or code switch. But the other piece is it rarely, if ever, shows up as we hate Jews. This form of unconscious anti-Semitism shows up as we're fighting for other virtues. So we might be fighting against white privilege, but then Jews end up being the whitest white and the most privileged. It could be a group on campus saying we can't sponsor with Hillel because it makes our Muslim students feel uncomfortable. And they don't voice that as we don't like Jews. They voice that as we're trying to protect Muslim students who already feel unsafe on campus. So it doesn't often make sense to show up in these spaces and say, you are a Jew hater, because in their heart of hearts, that's probably not how they feel. But what they're doing is something that's unconscious, where they're trading in unconscious or unintended anti-Semitic tropes or stereotypes or dog whistles. They're trying to stand up for some other minoritized group, but they're doing it in a way where they're actually creating a very psychologically unsafe environment for Jewish people. And this tends to be the kind of anti-Semitism that you see on the far left, in progressive groups, on campus. A lot of times when people are talking about anti-Zionism, they would say things just like that young woman did from SJP, which is, I love Jews, I just don't like Zionists. And here's the other thing, and this relates to Daryl Horn's writing about the Hanukkah story, which is Hanukkah was not just Jews versus other people. It was also the good Jews, the Jews who had adopted all of the norms of Hellenism, against the Jews who wanted to remain distinctive and particularistic. So what she points out here is that there are often Jews who are propagating these ideas. They've internalized these kind of implicit anti-Semitic tropes. They work them into their Jewish identity, and they're the ones out there saying essentially the same thing that people who are trading in these unconscious anti-Semitic tropes are. And what this does in a lot of ways is it provides cover for those people to say, look, we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Zionist. Look, here are Jews saying it over here. And again, what I would say if I was trying to explain this or teach this to well-meaning folks in liberal cities or universities or in governments or on a library board, is that this is how all of these forms of marginalization function, which is Black folks internalize images of racism into their own identities. And just like, we're divided into the good ones and the bad ones, people who are trading in racist tropes can often find someone who's Black to stand up and say, no, 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 this is fine with me. I agree with them in this case. Just because you find one token minoritized member of the group to say it's okay shouldn't really give any of us license to make blanket statements and to trade in dog whistles and implicit bias tropes against the group. And part of what this allows us to do as leaders is to say, please don't think that anti-Semitism is just conscious Jew hatred like neo-Nazis. It happens here like just being part of a Western society. We'll talk about this more a little bit later, but people get this through osmosis. It's in the culture to kind of see Jews as different and other, and to quietly ascribe to Jews certain kind of powers or the ability to pull the strings. And there may be a lot of people who could be turned into allies if we help do education with these folks. So they started to understand that, just like, some guy in your family who shows up at Thanksgiving and says, I'm not racist, I have black friends, but, and then follows it up with a bunch of implicitly racist comments. Those are people where I think saying that they hate is not really the right approach, but rather to help them understand that just by living in America or Europe, or getting the media or the social media they're getting, they've absorbed these tropes. And so here, kind of on the left side of this graph, when we're dealing with conscious anti-Semitism, here you got to point it out and you fight very aggressively. And when someone is calling for the murder of Jews or the destruction of Jewish bodies, we want to marshal Jewish resources and partners and allies to really cancel that kind of speech and to make it abundantly clear that these people cannot be in leadership positions, in government, in media, in public discourse. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, essentially, I'm saying that there's a huge number of people who are propagating these ideas who don't mean it to have the damage it's going to have. And so here I think plan A is education. And can we convert some of these people into allies, just like all the well-meaning men who want to be allies to feminism, who have to learn how to think deeply about the implicit negative messages that they get about women. For all of us who want to be white allies and may not realize that some of the messages we got at kids are preventing us from being the best allies possible. It's that same kind of approach. And given that this form of anti-Semitism is more active on the far political left, this is also using the rhetoric and the value structure on the left to help people understand that even though you think you're trying to do something good, you might actually be hurting more than you're helping. Now that we've demystified the different types of anti-Semitism, I want to run through three core definitions. One of the things I find is that, there's the old joke, two Jews, three opinions, that there's so many different opinions about what anti-Semitism is. That's all good when it comes to analysis, but it actually makes it really hard to define it, and especially if you're trying to educate a constituent group like a government or a city council or a school board about what are the definitions, it gets a little too complicated. And so I wanted to try to simplify this for everybody. And I chose four of these because I think that they really get at the core, not just of what we as Jews need to say about what anti-Semitism is, but because they also, I think, really work to disarm people politically about some of the contemporary issues. And I'll point that out as we go. But the first is, and this really comes from a professor at the University of Chicago named David Nirenberg, is that anti-Semitism is baked into the very foundation of Western civilization. And he says in a very interesting way that every civilization is built with a particular boogeyman on the other side. So, for example, if you read the Torah, the boogeyman in the Torah is the Amalekites. They're the ultimate wicked caricature. That if you want to ascribe to one group of people evil or cunning, it's always the Amalekites, and or maybe at the very least, it's all idol worshippers. If you look at the New Testament, Christianity is really built on Jews as the other. If you look in Islamic tradition, it is built on superseding Christianity and Judaism. And so in this way, when you look at Western tradition, this is going all the way back to Hellenism and Alexander the Great. Jews have always been the consummate other and the scapegoat. And so this is a tradition in Western civilization that goes back even before the beginning of Christianity. You can find some of the very same tropes that we see today existing, in before the year zero. And what's interesting about this is that it's not really about Jews or Judaism. It is that there is a habit when a moment in time becomes scary or the world seems upside down, or there's economic or cultural or political turmoil, the habit in Western tradition is to blame Jews as somehow to blame or more to blame than anyone else, that Jews are somehow pulling the strings, or that Jews are somehow subverting everything that was good in the society. And so, on the one hand, this seems to make some sense, but what's also very difficult here is that the what is wrong with the Jews or how Jews are othered or how Jews are scapegoated really changes. And what tends to happen is whatever the worst thing you could be in a society, Jews become more responsible for that thing. The next piece is, and I think that this is important, which is I want to draw the distinction that this is not about necessarily hate or discrimination or racism, but I think the best definition for what anti-Semitism is that is a conspiracy theory. And the reason that I don't want to make it all about discrimination, hate, or racism is there's a couple of reasons. One is that it creates a little bit of a competition between do we worry about anti-Semitism as a form of hate or other things like racism or sexism or homophobia. And the truth is that I don't always think it's a great look, especially when we're trying to advocate against anti-Semitism on the far left. If we're trying to say that this is more critical than other forms of discrimination. And the truth is that Jews are not as widely hated in North America as other groups are, according to outside research. That Jews don't face the structural discrimination about getting into universities or into social clubs or professions like we did in the 50s. And that, thank God, when there is a terrible tragedy in the Jewish community, there are police and FBI rushing in to help. And not every group feels like they have the support of the police or the government in that way. So this is why I like the conspiracy theory definition, is that it kind of de-escalates the victim contest that exists. But what I think it also kind of helps us understand is because the forms of anti-Semitism keep morphing, that is kind of what helps the conspiracy theory thing stick, which is that whatever it is, the thing that is the worst thing to be, whether it's a racist or a socialist or a communist or a capitalist, somehow or another, Jews are that boogeyman, and we're always worse or more extreme or more responsible for it. You can see it, even in the moment recently where the US government attacked Venezuela. All of a sudden there were people saying that it was Israel behind it. And that's like a perfect example of somehow Jews in Israel being brought into being blamed for things that really have nothing to do with the Jewish community in North America or the Jewish community living in Israel. The second thing that I think is very powerful about this is the conspiracy theory language allows us to say, we are on your side, other minority group, whatever that minority group is. And the reason it matters, the reason we shouldn't be fighting about whether it's worse for women or worse for Asians or worse for Black folks or worse for queer folks is because all of these forms of hate fuel one form to another. And any society that embraces conspiracy theories like anti-Semitism ends up becoming a more fertile ground for embracing hate. And sometimes that's intellectual hate, and sometimes that's violent hate against other minority groups. And the truth is, any groups, any societies that embrace hate are also more likely to embrace conspiracy theories. So when we're sitting down trying to convince folks on the left that anti-Semitism should be one of the isms that is a core part of the things that we're fighting to protect against and that we're fighting to defeat, one of the important talking points is that is as Black folks or queer folks or women or Muslims or Asian, we are all in this together because a society that embraces hate against you is much more likely to embrace the conspiracy theory against me as a Jew. And if we allow for the conspiracy theory of anti-Semitism to exist, it's going to be much more fertile for other forms of hate and discrimination. And so there's a way of kind of tying us together with all of the groups that make up the intersectional coalition of trying to fight against hate and discrimination in our societies. The third thing I want to focus on is replacement theory. And this is a great tool that you can kind of use to help diagnose anti-Semitism on the right or the left. But again, if people are chanting Jews will not replace us, some folks might not immediately understand why that is so anti-Semitic. And there's other versions of it on the left that you'll see, which is sometimes you'll see a version of Jews on the left. They'll say things, people will say things like, um, essentially, there are bigger victims to focus on right now. And so we shouldn't get distracted from police shootings against Black folks or hate crimes against queer folks. So we shouldn't get distracted and also think about protecting Jews. And that's a form of replacement theory, which is in some way, Jews are replacing the real people on either side. So on the far right, replacement theory shows up as replacing real Americans or real white people. Um, on the left, it shows up often as replacing the real victims, the real marginalized people, or the real indigenous. And so this, you can already see how this is a tool where it might not make sense to someone who isn't educated in all of this stuff to understand why people marching in Charlottesville chanting Jews will not replace us is so anti-Semitic. But what this gives you a chance is you can say no, no, it is, because the replacement theory would say that these far right extreme white nationalists don't trust Jews because the theory goes we look white, but we don't act white because we act like minorities and we side with other minority groups in America. Therefore, we are a deep threat to the real white Americans because our presence here infiltrates the real pure white America. And that's how it functions on the right. And on the left, you end up with sometimes very conscious things where people are angry, like, how dare the Jewish community want there to be a vigil. I'll tell a real story here, actually. There was a moment on campus where all around the same time period, there were attacks on Black folks, on Muslim folks, and on queer folks. And a student rally and vigil began to grow. And when Jewish students showed up and said, we'd like to include the Jews who were murdered at the French magazine Charlie Hebdo, the pushback was, well, if we start to include everyone, it doesn't mean anything. And that was more political. And so all of a sudden, you could see that while there was this coalition of minoritized groups, by including Jews, there was a subconscious fear that it was going to replace the emphasis on the real victims. And that the Jews who were murdered at Charlie Hebdo, where it was not political, it was just murder, because they were Jews, all of a sudden took on a different thing. That's an example. Another example is there have been instances in liberal news articles where the article will say, again, trying to do something good, which is if they're trying to describe Jesus and they want to acknowledge that Jesus might not have been blonde hair and blue-eyed like some of the Christian depictions from Christian Europe, but he was more Mediterranean or Middle Eastern or Semitic, which is a nice thing to try to do. But in the end, what the reporter did was they said Jesus, parentheses or comma, who is most likely a Palestinian man of color. And the problem there is that Jesus was Jewish. Jesus lived in Judea, which was a province of the Roman Empire at the time. And there was no such thing as Palestine or Palestinians, not for thousands of years. What they were trying to do is say that Jesus wasn't blonde-haired and blue-eyed, but in the process of trying to make him seem really indigenous, they use this strange subconscious anachronism that kind of whitewashed Jews out of that thing and made him Palestinian as opposed to Jewish. And so this idea of Jews replacing the real indigenous, even for something 2,000 years ago, is that form of implicit unconscious anti-Semitism. And again, you can use this structure of replacement theory to help bring consciousness to that. The third piece is the double bind, which is the process over history of accusing Jews of being two different things at the same time, which are totally irreconcilable. Somehow or another, Jews are weak and pathetic and subhuman, and that they're strong and merciless and oppressive. You see this again dating back to Greek-controlled Egypt before Christianity during the Hellenistic period. There is images of this. This is something you often see in the conversations about the first war of Israel independence in 1948, where you see tropes where the Arab communities there were both very ashamed of losing to Jews who were so weak and pathetic, but also the kind of terrible, murderous, strong and merciless military intervention that was used. And you see this today with Jews in America seen as both incredibly strong and powerful, pulling the strings behind the scene, and Jews being seen as weak and pathetic, either not proudly identified with their faith or they're not representing white folks in the right way. Whatever it is, these are not factually based, but they play on this trying to accuse Jews of two things at once. You see this as Jews being rich and cheap. You see as Jews were both hated in the 20th century during the Cold War for being capitalist and hated for being socialist. So this, we're not the only ones that get this. Other minoritized groups sometimes fall into these same tropes. But these, I think, are four very simple ways to define anti-Semitism. And I think they're tools baked into this that can help you disarm the people that you're trying to educate, because this first one here about Western civilization highlights that we all get images, and we absorb those images, and that's why we need consciousness raising with good people like you. That this thing that you're doing where you think it's really about protecting other minority groups might have tropes of replacement theory, right? Part of why it might be so hard for you to understand that Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel is because you've absorbed some passive replacement theory, and therefore you only see Arabs and Palestinians as indigenous people. And again, this double bind. Good. In the next segment, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the things that will help bring this to life. It's really going to get into the dog whistles that are out there in our society that sometimes are hard to pick up on. Now, what I want to do is to help make clear some of the anti-Semitic dog whistles that are out there. Some of these might be obvious to you, but I think that this is a pretty good list to share, especially if you're trying to do some education with folks who aren't deeply educated about the experience of Jews in North America. So you have some of these big classic anti-Semitic dog whistles, which is capitalist and socialist. But you also hear things like when you hear globalist or the elite, the news media, or the internationalists, all of these are actually dog whistles. And so not everyone who hates the news media is intending to say that they hate Jews. But one of the distinctions I draw is that people who hate Jews, when they hear someone railing against the news media, hear Jew. And so that's the way the dog whistles work, is that sometimes the person blowing the dog whistle intends everyone to understand what they mean. And sometimes they might just be using it because it's the popular language that's used. And in that situation, they may not intend it, but it has an impact where other people hear and consciously or subconsciously associate it with Jew. And so this is stuff you hear a lot of, especially as our politics have become more divisive. You hear more and more people railing against capitalism, socialism, globalism, the elites, the news media, and the internationalists. Um, you will also hear Zionist, and you will hear Zionist to mean, sometimes people mean Zionist to mean supporters of the current government of the state of Israel. But Zionist has a deep history of being an anti-Semitic dog whistle that was used both by the Nazis in World War II and by the Soviet Union, where the Soviets killed hundreds of thousands of Jews, punishing them as Zionists, not as Jews. And they basically tried to create a difference without a real meaningful distinction, which is that they are okay with Jews, but not okay with Zionists. And this is again a form of implicit and conscious anti-Semitism, where you're trying to divide between the good Jews and the bad Jews. But the problem is that this is a word that is not a clean word, right? Zionism can't just be used to talk about what's going on in 2025 or 2026. I think people who are sensitive and thoughtful and want to be good allies to the Jewish community need to understand that this is a word that has been used to kill Jews and has blood all over it. And so it is an incendiary term, whether the person using it means it or not. So this is why I put an asterisk here, because that history is important for helping people understand. And there's a way to say, I understand you might have your views about Israel, but when you're using incendiary language with the term Zionist connected to it, you might be inadvertently trading in, 150 years of bloody anti-Semitic tropes. And in the same way, you wouldn't want to use terminology that was used to kill or persecute gay people, or that was used to kill or persecute people of color, or indigenous people. The same thing applies here. And let's just use those same rules that we think of on the left as so lofty, that these are tools that you can use to educate folks on the left who believe in these words very much. The other kind of terms that you see are New York can be code for Jew, dual loyalties, which is that Jews aren't real Americans or real Canadians because of our dual loyalties. But it's interesting. I was teaching about this to a college summit run by Hillel International, and I gave the example of a student leader at one of the California schools who there was a protest when she was elected. I think it was to an executive council or something in student government. And people were saying she can't be trusted to be objective on student government or on this executive council because she's Jewish and therefore a Zionist. And one of the college students said to me recently, but isn't it true? I mean, it is probably more likely that a Jewish person would be a Zionist. And I said, that's not the part that's discriminatory or anti-Semitic. The part that is problematic is that in a world where these progressive schools want diversity on student government, and they believe that like only a person of color or an indigenous person or a woman or a queer person could bring their lived experience to represent it on student government. And in every one of those situations, that kind of diverse experience is valuable, but the Jewish diverse experience is somehow seen as illegitimate or suspicious. That's where it becomes deeply anti-Semitic. So this is stuff you'll see over and over again, in places where you need to kind of raise consciousness that people might not realize what they're doing is anti-Semitic. This dual loyalty piece is a key. Anytime Jews are depicted as animals, as puppeteers controlling things, these are deeply anti-Semitic tropes. Poisoning the well. You'll hear people use that just as an expression to say, like, someone really threw cold water on a good idea. They'll say, oh, he really poisoned the well. But this is an anti-Semitic trope that goes back to the Black Plague, and you see it resurfacing even during the coronavirus in the image down here on the bottom left. And the final two are important to spend a minute talking about, which is Jews are just a religion. And this is something you see showing up a lot in anti-Zionism, where people kind of say, I understand why the ethnic group of the Palestinian people need a state, but I don't believe in religious states, and Jews are just a religion. I'm allowed to hate Zionists because they're not the same things as Jews believe in love your neighbor as yourself and giving tzedakah, giving charity. What I hate are Zionist Jews who think Jews should have a state. And the reality is, and this is an important fact to be able to own and to be able to educate, is that all religions that predate Christianity were always a mix of religion, ethnicity, peoplehood, geography, civil law, religious law. There was no separating of these things. And you saw this, and you see it today in all of the ancient religions that still exist that predate Christianity. But Christianity had a new ingredient, which is it brought the universalism of Hellenism into it. And Hellenism believed that there was one right system for government and governance. And as Alexander the Great conquered much of the world at that time, he asserted that we are going to kind of convert you politically to our form of governance and government. And so Christianity and Islam and newer religions believe that anybody can be part of religion. It has nothing to do with peoplehood or ethnicity or land, but all religions that predate it do. So usually when people are reducing Judaism to just a religion, there is an unconscious and implicit form of anti-Semitism at play. I do want to say that there are Jews who think of Judaism as just a family and they're not religious, right? There's lots of Jews like that in North America. Pew Research calls them nuns, right? But not nuns like Christian, female Christian nuns, but nuns like None. That's okay if people think that. And it's also okay if individual Jews say, for me, I relate to Judaism just as a religion or a system of values and not as an ethnic group. But where it becomes anti-Semitic is other people using that to define us. And it ignores really 2,000 years of history where that is just not a norm throughout history, even if individual Jews believe different things at different times. The final piece is you see this a lot again coming up with politics and anti-Semitism, but even on the far right, when neo-Nazis hate white Jews because they're race traitors and infiltrators to pure white America, anytime that all Jews are labeled as white Europeans, I think you're trading in anti-Semitic tropes. We know that European Jews come in lots of different shades. My wife is a redhead, which is not the standard stereotype of Eastern European Jew. But you can also have Eastern European Jews because of intermarriage, because of population migrations that actually have dark skin and have curly hair and might look more like folks living in the kind of Stan regions of Asia, or might look more like people from North Africa, or everything in between. But also Jews who are from Mizrahi background, Jews who are descendant from Arab lands in the Middle East and North Africa, might have different complexions, as do Black Jews, some of whom come from long-standing, deep Black communities in North Africa, or even many multi-generation Black communities in America, as do Jews who are Jews who converted or who were adopted or things like that. So anytime you try to stereotype all Jews into one ethnic group, you're also getting into problems. So I hope this gives you a little bit of a list and a little bit of nuance to be able to use this to say the reason what you just said is anti-Semitic, even though I know you don't hate Jews, is because you're accidentally trading in a very deep trope that while you may mean to be doing something positive for the world, you're inadvertently doing something negative. Again, this falls more on that kind of implicit anti-Semitism side of the equation from Darrell Horn. Now that we've dealt with those other themes, I want to lay out a little bit of information or thought about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and criticism of Israel. This is probably one of the more painful and intense versions of the debate that Jews have about what anti-Semitic is and the debate that other folks have in defining what anti-Semitism is. And I'm trying to say something here that I think is intellectually honest, even if it doesn't always make me comfortable or isn't always what I love. And so I don't want anyone listening offline to get triggered by this. But I do think it is important, even though I don't love criticism of Israel, and I generally think that I love Israel, and there's lots of things I could critique about the government or certain policies that exist. But I also know that as someone who loves Israelis and Israel, I know that there's a lot of biased criticism out there that sometimes puts me in the defensive. So I feel that, and so I'm not trying to add to that. But what I want to say is, especially in settings like university settings or government settings where free speech and free expression are important values, I think it is important politically to say that even though I may not always love the criticism of Israel, that we don't want to position the Jewish community on being on the side of silencing that. In other words, things that are critical of a policy, how Israel's conducting a military operation, what Bibi Netanyahu said about A, B, or C, those are things which are within the range of what Israelis are debating and what a civil society can debate about. It's fair for Americans to debate about those things when it comes to China or Brazil without being labeled racist or classist or regionist in that way. But the question is, what happens when we get into anti-Zionism? And what I have come to really believe and think is important to say and to teach, and I say this very carefully, which is that pure anti-Zionism is inextricably linked to anti-Semitism. Now, there are people who say they're anti-Zionist who are not by our definition. There are Jewish people who say I'm anti-Zionist, but they're really just against the war against Gaza. And they say things like, I don't want this war to continue, but I still think there should be a Jewish state. So we're defining anti-Zionist as somebody who doesn't think that there should be a Jewish state, who is against the idea that Jews have the right to self-determination in a safe and secure Jewish state in the land of Israel. And why I think advocating against Jewish self-determination for a safe Jewish state in secure borders within the state of Israel is inextricably linked to anti-Semitic actions is twofold. First, in the previous slide, I showed you that Zionism is not a neutral term. And saying that you hate Zionists or want to punish Zionists is something that has been used in the 20th century to kill Jews. And so what I've said to student activists who are never going to love Israel is it is okay if you want to be critical of Israel, just be better at it. Because when you're using all these anti-Zionist slogans, you are using terminology that's been used to kill, murder, round up, and arrest Jewish people for their politics. And I don't think that that's the world that you want as a liberal activist. So say we're against this policy of the state of Israel as opposed to just throwing the Z word around, which is kind of a dog whistle, right? And it's again, those same people wouldn't want the words, sloppy use of words around Black folks or queer folks or women. And so we're asking them to just be consistent in their use of careful language. But the second reason is that some people think when they say I'm anti-Zionist that they're expressing a political belief, like like a theoretical thing, and that is something that could have been true in 1920. In 1920, there were major Jewish leaders like Oriel Simon and Martin Buber who were against the idea of a single ethnic Jewish state. But that was before the state existed. It was before that the largest Jewish community lived in the state of Israel. And so today, after the establishment of the state, this is now the largest and only independent Jewish community in the world. And to advocate for the political destruction, the military destruction, the boycott of the only independent Jewish community in the world is advocating a kind of material harm that could mean displacement, it could mean genocide, it could mean ethnic cleansing, it could mean simply, in the most gentle version, the revoking of the self-determination of the largest and only independent Jewish community's rights in the world. And I just think that you may try as you might, feel as you might in your heart, you can't advocate and say, I'm an anti-Zionist without also implying that you're advocating against the self-determination of this Jewish community. And so I just think these things are inextricably linked. And so the line that I often draw when I'm doing these trainings or trying to help people understand it is it is totally fair if you want to advocate for Palestinian rights. It is totally fair if you want to criticize policies of Israel or features of the Israeli society, but don't fall into the trap of the blanket anti-Zionism, right? Don't hold all Jews accountable for the actions of the state of Israel. This is a form of anti-Semitism that is equivalent. I often use the analogy of it's like attacking anybody who looks Asian on the street because you happen to see some conspiracy theory video that blamed Asian people for COVID. One of my best friends from high school talked to me about how terrified he was about sending his kids to school on public buses in a world where people were beating up Asian people because of COVID. And applying that kind of exclusion or suspicion to Jews because they're Zionist. This is the exact same form of dual loyalty dog whistle that we talked about a few minutes ago. So I think the idea is I think we don't ever want to position Jews against free speech as a constitutional right in terms of the government. And to some degree, free expression on campus, I do think is an important thing. But what we're advocating here is that we're helping people understand that there is a way to advocate against Israel that is no longer just free speech or political thought, but really becomes anti-Semitic in its tropes, that becomes discriminatory in the way that it blames all Jews, that is applies dual loyalties and anti-Semitic dog whistles, where this is not just free political expression anymore, but starts to be something else. And in the same way, the university would invest a huge amount of money to educate against unconscious racist tropes or sexist tropes or homophobic tropes. This is where I think there's a huge amount of room for us to both advocate to combat anti-Semitism, but also not to put it into the university's eyes or a city council's eyes or a school board's eyes that it's either make Jewish students feel safe or support free speech, which I think is a very dangerous political position for the Jewish community to be stuck in. So I hope this all helped. And you can always reach out to us at JFNA for additional trainings. We'll make sure that my email is linked here, but my email is michael.uram@jfna.org. And we're always happy to help bring additional resources to bear to help you make this come to life in your community or to use it as a tool for educating or for advocating. Thank you for joining us.